Good afternoon, everyone. As the newest board member, I am honored to be here. Thank you, Ms. CEO, for trusting me to review and advise on this innovative recommendation. I will be discussing interpretations of servant leadership. This presentation will provide an evaluation of servant leadership utilizing an evidence-based approach. It is important to have a clear understanding of what servant leadership is as we begin the process of examining implications of its integration into Brookshore Industries. The significance of incorporating an evidence-based approach is to identify the most efficient method of decision-making based on the most effective evidence. The methods are gathered using various interventions, reviews of current data, scientific experiments, as well as testing and interpreting variables and data. Robert K. Greenleaf is considered the founder of the modern servant leadership movement and the Greenleaf Center for Servant Leadership. There is something to be said about the concept of servant leadership and its potential influence on corporations. However, the question that stands out as I review the article provided by Mrs. CEO is whether this model works for all companies. In the article, the only company type was 3 very specific high-performing automobile dealerships that were used in this study. Is the servant leadership model specific to this company, or can it work for any company? Is there a correlation, or is it a coincidence? Based on the findings, did this model even work for this company? As we discussed when this idea was presented, it is important to consider a well-rounded approach to fully understanding the concept of servant leadership before we decide whether to change the culture of Brookshore Industries. We will review 2 articles that utilize quantitative research from 2 varying perspectives. We will review the similarities as well as the differences in both approaches of each article, concluding on how best to proceed with the recommendations of incorporating servant leadership into Brookshore Industries. During this presentation, we will define leadership as interpreted through the review of the 2 articles. We will discuss McCarr and Boscall's article highlighting the purpose and literature review. We will discuss Kickler, Callahan, and Kickler's article, evaluating again the purpose and literature review. We will evaluate the philosophical perspectives of each article. We will evaluate the research and design and methodology of each article. We will review the data identified in the research articles, and we will compare the information derived from each article. Finally, we will review the recommendations based on the above information. As a note, information highlighted in blue will be from the Achieving High Organization Performance Through Servant Leadership article, and information highlighted in brown will be from Exploring the Boundaries of Servant Leadership article. In this slide, we're talking about leadership. Both articles provided strong definitions of leadership and what it takes to be a strong leader within an organization. Much of the literature they cited supported leaders as creating a culture of empowerment or who are looking to improve an ethical culture within their respective organizations, acknowledging that a good leader must be knowledgeable and competent. Both articles also demonstrated that the servant leader model offers a positive alternative to other leadership theories, moving the concept of leadership to one that embraces positive behavior in a supportive environment for human growth and development, and that servant leaders take responsibility for the organization as it relates to stakeholders, modeling ethical behavior so that others may emulate them and in turn serve others and ultimately become servant leaders themselves. Achieving High Organization Performance Through Servant Leadership, according to the UMGC Library One Search, is found in a scholarly peer-reviewed journal, the Journal of Business Inquiry. As we review the article provided by Ms. CEO, it is important to highlight the year of publication, which is 2010. There have been many additional studies that have been published since this article, which has expanded the concept and analysis of servant leadership. Between 2017 and 2019, there have been multiple studies on servant leadership, and the range of study has been significantly expanded. However, the efforts and purpose of this article was strong enough to consider the investigation of servant leadership. The purpose was to investigate whether a servant leader can develop a corporate culture that attract or develop other servant leaders. The purpose was a great start for one considering enhancing the culture of an existing organization, such as Brookshore Industries. The literature review within this article was extensive as it relates to the topic of leadership and the servant leadership model. Exploring the boundaries of servant leadership, a meta-analysis of the main and moderating effects on servant leadership on behavior and effective outcomes was written by D. Scott Kicker, Judith Scully Callahan, and Mary Kicker. The article was published by the peer-reviewed journal of Management Issues, whose publisher is Pittsburgh State University. The purpose of this article is to answer the call for additional exploration into servant leadership by first offering a comprehensive exploration of the main effects of servant leadership on organizationally relevant outcomes such as job performance, organizational citizenship behavior, job satisfaction, commitment, and trust. In addition, however, the author seeks to extend the servant leadership literature by organizing and empirically examining the many different possible moderator variables that might impact the strength or nature of these main effects. There were well over 24 peer-reviewed articles cited within this article focused on servant leadership. There are multiple articles on tests conducted, servant assessments completed, correlations identified, and meta-analysis performed. Servant leadership is considered on multiple levels in this article, including but not limited to individual and group level servant leadership, samples of primarily male or primarily female servant leadership, many different cultural contexts, for-profit and non-profit organizations. Recent advancement and trends toward a more global measurement of servant leadership was also examined. One of the key goals of this article was to shed light on future research based on its findings. Melcar's and Bosco's ontological perspective focused on relying on evidence gathered from the data derived from the questionnaires. Reality is universal, objective, and quantifiable. Their epistemological perspective was their empirical study to investigate whether a servant leader can develop a corporate culture that attracts or develops other servant leaders. Positivism, empirical data to understand human behavior. Their axiological perspective was captured in their value-free reliance on the objective responses within the research questions. The servant leadership questionnaire was open-ended. Kicker et al.'s ontological perspective focused on using a systematic approach when determining the article's search and inclusion criteria for the meta-analysis. 67 studies, 133 samples provided sufficient information to obtain effect size estimates on servant leadership, employee outcome linkages of interest. Quantifiable. Their epistemological perspective focused on ensuring that for a study to be included in the final database, it had to be an empirical examination of the effect of servant leadership on at least one level of the linkages under the investigation. Positivism, empirical data. Their axiological perspective focused on the appropriate articles were included, and any articles that appear to show bias were excluded. Value-free. Both articles utilized the quantitative research design. However, Melcar and Bosco used a qualitative interview for their methodology. They used the servant leader questionnaire, then recorded, rated, and categorized the responses from the questionnaire. Kilker et al. Used a comprehensive meta-analysis for their methodology. For each dependent variable, an overall analysis was conducted, then separate subgroups analysis within the same dependent variable category were subsequently performed to examine moderator effect. Although the literature review was very strong regarding the concept of leadership in organizations and the servant leadership method, there were several challenges with the data from Achieving High Organizational Performance article. However, for the sake of time, we will highlight just a few. 1. Only 3 high-performing automobile dealerships was involved in the study. which creates the question, the correlation of servant leadership results to specific organizations versus any potential organization. There was a total of 59 respondents from the combined 3 dealerships, which makes it unclear how many people participated per dealership. It challenges the validity of the variables, and the limitations of the pool of participants restricts the results in the analysis. And because of the low response from the 3 dealerships, all of the demographic variables for all 3 dealerships was combined into one data pool, and this creates skewed and distorted data. The questionnaires that were conducted, the manager's response was low and therefore not included in the analysis. And the absence of the response of the managers results in flawed data. The authors were very careful to consider servant leadership holistically. Many variables were incorporated into the meta-analysis. All measures concerning specific components of servant leadership were identified, carefully reviewed, and categorized for this study. All variables were coded independently by the authors, and any disagreements on coding were resolved through consensus. Multiple peer-reviewed articles were cited in by authors on all categories and studies of leadership, characteristics of leadership, management, servant leadership, trust, job performance, global effectiveness, gender, other businesses, etc., to gather all the components needed for the meta-analysis. The meta-analysis combines the results of multiple scientific studies addressing the same question. It uses the original data from all the data to create a new analysis and draw conclusions that could potentially be more meaningful. It can be more useful for inferring causation than a single study. The original article focused on a single study and 2 hypotheses. This article focused on 67 studies and 9 hypotheses. A total of 44 different meta-analyses were performed to examine the 5 hypothesized main effects and 4 hypothesized moderator effects. Again, the meta-analysis was carefully matched with each hypothesis for the study. For the sake of time, I will share a few of the results. Overall, consistent with the results of the prior research, results showed that servant leadership had a positive main effect on both job performance and job-related attitudes. Hypothesis 1 suggested that servant leadership could be positively associated with job performance. The results were ranked on 29 studies, a total sample size of 8,471 participants, and an uncorrelated sample size weighted mean correlation of 0.33. Hypothesis 2, that servant leadership could be positively associated with employee organizational citizenship behavior, was also supported based on 28 studies with 8,438 participants, and that servant leadership had a correlation of 0.40. Hypothesis 3 through 5, which predicted that there would be a significant positive effect on servant leadership, job satisfaction, organizational commitment, and trust, were each supported by the data, specifically the overall effect of servant leadership on job satisfaction, based on 39 studies, 11,162 participants, with a correlation of 0.50, while the correlation between servant leadership and organizational commitment was based on 23 studies, 6,884 participants, and a correlation of 0.40. And finally, the correlation between servant leadership and follower trust based on 14 studies and 3,073 participants with a correlation of 0.64. Thereby, hypothesis 1 through 5 each were supported. Similar tests were conducted on hypothesis 7 through 9, showing patterns of correlation based in part due to placement of subgroups, independent and dependent variables, the independent and group levels, and large study and sample sizes. However, the author concludes that while overall sample sizes were large, it was still somewhat small relative to a number of analyses conducted. Hypothesis 6 was generally supported, however, the pattern of observed results was somewhat mixed. Hypothesis 7 proposed that the main effect of servant leadership on follower outcomes would be moderator moderated by culture. Hypothesis 7 examined the potential moderating effect on follower gender on the servant leadership follower linkages. Results showed that in most male samples, servant leaders had a higher correlation with job performance than it did in studies containing a mostly female sample. Hypothesis 9 predicted that the effect of servant leadership on follower outcomes would vary depending on whether the data was collected in a traditional profit-seeking business or were instead a nonprofit organization. Consistent with this hypothesis, results showed that the effect of servant leadership on job performance was higher in non-business settings compared to business settings, though the reverse pattern was found with regard to organizational citizenship behavior, with the effect of servant leadership being higher in business samples than was observed in non-business settings. In Meckler and Boscal, the authors used the qualitative research method, then analyzed the results obtained. They concentrated more on the interviews and less on the hypothesis and significance of statistical tests. The data collection methods these authors used was open-ended surveys. Although the author supports the contention that the modeling of servant leadership by strategic level managers can create an organizational culture in which servant leaders developed among lower level managers, the review of the data creates more questions than answers. In Caker et al., the authors focused more on facts rather than opinions. They demonstrated servant leadership conveying a cross-section of themes specific to the topic. This article used quantitative research methods for research and design. The author also focused more on the hypothesis. In this study, the author provided a meta-analysis of the relationship between servant leadership and the importance of organizational outcomes such as job performance, organizational citizenship behavior, job satisfaction, organizational commitment, and trust. The goal is not simply to explore overall effects of servant leadership on these outcomes. Instead, it hoped to present an empirical summary understanding the current state of the servant leadership research by explicitly examining the effects associated with key moderating variables such as culture, gender, and methodological approaches. At the core of this research is a shared understanding that servant leaders are motivated to lead and have a need to serve. However, fundamental issues such as defining and measuring the constructs have not been standardized. It is therefore recommended that until the industry as a whole has a better grasp on the fundamental process of reorganizing an entire organization, it is best to table this idea and to continue to follow the research. If there comes a time for servant leadership to be considered at Brookshore Industries, not only must it be a unanimous decision among leaders, it must be a concept accepted throughout the company as a whole. It will not succeed if only one department or one manager buys into the idea. Everyone from the board, the executives, upper management, middle management, and so on must believe in the concept of servant leadership. Thank you.